This is the third video of a three-part series diving into the story of the Good Samaritan. Like many familiar stories in the Bible, we often glance over the power and impact of the story because we know it so well. I hope to look at this parable and in three parts draw out lessons we can learn or relearn. In my previous two videos, we looked at how loving God and loving our neighbor are inseparable. And when we make one more important at the expense of the other, we no longer embody the love of Christ. We also saw that loving our neighbor is messy, but we understand the grace given to us and are willing to love people around us. I'm going to read again from Luke chapter 10, 25 through 37. And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law, and how do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And he set him on his own animal, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii, and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go, and do likewise." The third lesson we can draw from this passage is that our definition of who our neighbor is needs to be bigger and broader. I found it interesting that the protagonist of the story is not the priest or the Levite, who are Jewish, but rather a Samaritan, an insignificant person, considered an outsider and enemy of the Jewish people. Samaritans and Jews hated each other. Yet this enemy was the one who had compassion on the victimized man and not the religious travelers. This Samaritan was a vessel of God's love. You and I think we like to keep our circle of people we love very, very small. Even amongst our families and friends, co-workers or church members, there are people that we are drawn to who are similar to us and who are easy to love. People who are difficult, uncomfortable, needy, or disagreeable. We don't like to be with them, let alone love them. All of us quickly decide who's in and who's out. We do it in our families, we do it at work, we do it in our churches. And before we realize, our very arbitrary definition of neighbor is very, very small. I like what Tim Keller said in his book, Generous Justice. We instinctively tend to limit for whom we exert ourselves. We do it for people like us and for people whom we like. Jesus will have none of that. By depicting a Samaritan helping a Jew, Jesus could not have found a more forceful way to say that anyone at all in need, regardless of race, politics, class, and religion, is your neighbor. Not everyone is your brother or sister in faith, but everyone is your neighbor, and you must love your neighbor. Jesus modeled for us what loving our neighbor looks like as he broke through every single dividing barrier that existed at the time he was doing his ministry on the earth. These are the kinds of people that Jesus demonstrated for us that he loves and that we should love as our neighbor. Fishermen and a tax collector were part of his disciples. Fishermen were poor and uneducated, and tax collectors were generally hated because of their corruption and reputation for stealing. Jesus spent time with little children, widows, the elderly, a sinful woman, and beggars, people who were considered insignificant or outsiders. Jesus went out to and ministered to people with diseases who were demon-possessed, Samaritans and Gentiles. Again, these were people that the Jews would generally avoid because they were unclean and uncomfortable. These are the people that Jesus intentionally sought out, spent time with, and ministered to. He spent time with them over and over again, and he went to the outside and brought them in. This is telling us a loud and clear message. That person who has a different political view than me, that's my neighbor. That person who doesn't look like me or think like me, that is my neighbor. That person who may even hate Christians, that is my neighbor, and we are commanded to love them. Honestly, I'm being challenged every day to expand my definition of who my neighbor is. Like many people, I gravitate towards a small group of people that I'm comfortable with, some family members and friends mostly, because I'm busy and tired and I don't always feel like dealing with people who require more work to be around. If I'm honest, I find it easier to love God, whom I can't see, than the many people around me who are in my everyday life. But the call for us as Christians is to be in places in the corners of the world where God's love is not often talked about. Yes, there are places far away like the mission field and many people groups out there in the world who still haven't heard of the love of Christ. And we have a continuing and urgent need to reach these people and places. But rather than just waiting for the right time and planning for something far away, there's a lot we can do in the meantime today. There are neighbors all around us. For me, it's people in my actual neighborhood, many of whom are not followers of Christ. It's easy to keep them as nameless people that I encounter on a walk, and then forget about them and hurry back to the safety of my own home. But then I'm no different than anyone else in the world. I also have thousands of people at my work who are my neighbor. People from all kinds of backgrounds, political views, lifestyle choices, races, ages, and experiences. I can tell myself that they are just coworkers. Just do my job and then forget about them at the end of the day. Or I have a choice. Expand my world. See them as my neighbor. And even as busy as my work is, to care about the people I interact with, whether it's someone in a position many levels above me or many levels below me, or maybe even someone who's difficult. I have a choice to see the image of God in every person that I speak with, to care about them, to show them grace, love, and mercy, whether in my own human opinion they deserve it or not. So friends, I hope it was helpful to spend some time going deep into the passage of the Good Samaritan. Just to summarize, 1, we remember that loving God and loving our neighbor go together. 2, we are willing to get messy in loving our neighbor because Jesus got messy in loving us and paid the ultimate price. And 3, we see everyone as our neighbor because we see the image of God in every person, and that's why we love them. John 4:19 reminds us, we love because he first loved us. We were in a state of sin and separation from God. We owed the debt that we couldn't repay. But God, in his love, initiated the reconciling work and paid for it fully through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That love poured into us. That's the love that we pour into our neighbor.